too.
Okay, hello. My name is Dorian Franklin,
Hi, I'm Ashley Pena.
and today in our podcast titled Unsettling Histories, Exploring Colonial Narratives in the Americas, we're going to be diving into the silenced perspectives of ethnic minorities impacted by colonial expansion and hierarchical power dynamics within the Americas. So we will first be uncovering interoceanic diaspora and labor exploitation as shown in the Panama Canal and United Fruit Company, the parallels between Jim Crow in the US and Central America, as well as the importance of contextualizing Japanese American internment alongside American Indigenous relocation. And among these topics, we're going to be analyzing the interconnectedness of colonial violence and systemic oppression, how oppressed groups respond to racial hierarchies, and how we can combat the erasure of these ethnic and Indigenous narratives through education. We aim to illuminate the histories we have learned from this chapter and explore how we will take this knowledge with us in our careers as educators moving forward. So first, I will be interviewing Ashley today. She is a senior majoring in child and adolescent studies, focusing on elementary school settings. She plans to complete the multiple subject credential program at CSUF. That is one of the reasons that she took this course for the ethnic studies prerequisite for the credential program. She also decided to go with Chicano Studies Department to learn more about her Mexican native ancestry. She is a first generation student, and her father immigrated from Mexicali, Mexico, and her mother is from Armenia, Colombia. She is working towards becoming an elementary school teacher, preferably from kinder to third grade. Ideally, she would like to work in the Garden Grove Unified School District, where she is currently working as an instructional aide. GGUSD's students are mostly made up of minorities. This is another reason that she decided to take this course emphasizing ethnic minorities better to understand the problems and values of her future students and community. So our first question is, using examples from our readings, lectures, and podcasts, how do ethnic studies scholars unsettle histories of race in the hemisphere? Consider interoceanic diaspora in the Canal Zone.
Okay, thank you. So, ethnic studies scholars in Unit 2 unsettled what we understood about colonialism by introducing neocolonialism, which is a new form that does not always involve troops invading other countries or planting flags. A primary example of indirect colonialism is the creation of migration systems in the Canal Zone. Roosevelt was determined to have the right to land in Panama to begin the construction of the Canal Zone, which would successfully connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and gain global power. When Colombia rejected the treaty, he was left with two options, one being to take over Panama by invasion, or the other for Panama to declare its independence. What took place was a bloodless revolution. Instead of fighting Colombia, the United States paid off Colombian troops to retreat. The Panama Canal also sheds light on the exploitation of the American dream and shows the parallels between the segregation period in the United States and the Canal Zone. The skilled worker positions were reserved for white U.S. citizens. These were the blacksmiths, carpenters, drill operators, and plumbers. Most of the unskilled workers were Black and endured heavy physical labor, such as cutting brush, digging ditches, and loading and unloading equipment. Skilled workers were paid in gold, while unskilled workers were paid in silver. The gold roll employees were given paid sick leave, laundry service, and hot days off. There was a system of segregation in place where toilets, post offices, shops, and drinking fountains were marked for either silver or gold. A canal worker's descendant described it as polished segregation. John Stevens, the chief engineer of the Panama Canal, recruited most of his unskilled workers from Barbados, where the U.S. advertised the Panama Man. The strategy was to bring someone to Panama, and when they returned, they would be dressed in all white with a big smile, showing their gold teeth and pockets filled with money. Milian and Nowako compared it to Ellis Island, in which West Indian workers were recruited by United States from their home islands with both true and false promises about the presumably golden opportunity for building the canal.
I like that you brought up the American dream, especially when we're talking about our topic with multiple Americas. Like, what is the American dream? From what perspective? I like that you brought that up in your answer.
Thank you.
For number two, we're looking at how do we compare and contrast the histories of Jim Crow in the US versus Jim Crow colonialism in Central America.
Well, racist labor regimes have been transferred over to Central America from the United States. Although we touched on this topic in my last answer, we have seen this form of segregation and dehumanization of people of color time and time again. For instance, in Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Panama. In Colby's reading, we see the parallels between Jim Crow in the US and Jim Crow colonialism in Central America. The sources discussed in this week's content focus on United Fruit Central American Empire and the exploitation of its workers. African Americans left their homes after being promised better wages and living conditions by labor contractors. In Guatemala, they were met with systems like those back home, being subjected to menial positions and forced to address all white people as Mr. Supervisory and clerical positions were reserved for white people, while African Americans were confined to heavy plantation and stevedore work. Workers faced heavy workloads, carrying up to and over 100 pounds of bananas on their backs. The banana plantations were difficult to work in with harsh weather conditions, often in wet and muddy environments. Poisonous snakes occupied the banana plantations. Many workers got bitten. The life expectancy of the average man went down. To no surprise, the United Fruit's approach to medical care was also racialized, with the focus being on diseases that had a more significant impact on white people, such as malaria and yellow fever. Illnesses that were popular among laborers, like tuberculosis and pneumonia, were overlooked, and company doctors showed hesitation to admit them. Similar to segregation in the United States, people of color were excluded from white dining facilities, clubs, theaters, dances, tennis courts, and baseball leagues.
Right. And we still see that kind of today with people, the systemic racism of it all and the laws that we're making and keeping homeless people homeless and keeping them in those densely populated areas as well.
Yep,
I like
definitely.
that. Number 3, why is it urgent to read Japanese American internment alongside the American Indigenous relocation?
And the urgency to read about Japanese American internment alongside American indigenous relocation traces back to the discussion of global histories of solidarity. Firsthand reports and official government records are oftentimes inaccurate. So the resources in this section highlight the importance of coming together and sharing their stories to prevent history from being erased. Japanese Americans and American indigenous people were racialized and faced with systematic oppression and discrimination. Both groups had to uproot their lives and relocate and were forced to live in poor conditions in the same Castle Rock area. Another comparison is that both groups showed resistance. For example, Japanese Americans had the No-No Boys who refused to swear their loyalty to the United States, and the American indigenous people had a group led by Captain Jack who challenged the United States government when they were demanding to have them removed from their lands.
All right, and for number 4, using our sources, discuss how different minorities have responded and reacted to hierarchical power establishment. And with that, how does collective resistance contribute to the unification and memory of colonialized cultures and minorities?
Well, throughout the resources for this unit, there is evidence that minorities reacted and resisted the establishment of hierarchical power. For example, in 1910, pockets of resistance began appearing among laborers through Central America. United Fruit laborers went on strike, asking for basic rights in the workplace, such as 8-hour days, healthcare, hygienic living conditions, and weekly pay instead of waiting till the end of the month. In 1920, Colombian United Fruit workers began to organize, and in October 1928, 32,000 banana workers went on strike, causing the higher-ups of the United Fruit to panic. And as previously mentioned, an example of the resistance of Japanese Americans was the No-No Boys. No-No refers to the response when asked to swear their alliance to the United States of America. And the Modoc people also resisted when the military entered their homelands to force them back into the reservations. An example of this was when Scarface Charlie stood his ground when faced with a lieutenant. They both drew their weapons and fired at each other. Both sides began shooting, resulting in the Lost River Battle. In regards to how collective resistance contributes to the unification memory of colonized cultures and minorities by emerging Asian American and American Indian indigenous people studies, we understand that we are not alone and that the struggles we face that tie us together and shape the minority communities we see today.
I agree. Even across cultures, I think that's also important that we're, supporting each other and being allies, even though, our experiences, there is similarities, but they're not exactly the same. And it's important to highlight each of those histories individually as well as collectively. And our last question is, when considering histories of minorities and the erasure of Indigenous and ethnic histories, how do you believe we can combat this issue in schools and in higher education as future educators?
I really like this question because, as many of us can relate to, growing up, I wasn't taught about most of these occurrences. Like, aside from like the Japanese Americans being relocated, which we briefly went over, other than that, like I had never heard of like what was occurring like over with the Panama Canal and like the fruit, like that, like the chiquita bananas, like everyone knows those, like, but like you don't know like the dark history behind it. So
We're not taught that at
yeah,
all until
we
we
really
go to
aren't.
education, and a lot of people aren't having that experience as well. So
Yeah.
it's
Like that was my first time ever hearing that. Like, and I just like look at it differently now. Like I have some in my kitchen. I'm just like, oh, okay. But so the erasure of history in the US is attributed to history being taught through white American perspective, and the material to combat this, the materials presented in schools and higher education should represent various viewpoints and ensure that people and histories are accurately represented. There should also be a time set aside to facilitate student discussions, like encouraging students to share their perspectives, like you said, like to support each other because we all have like different backgrounds. Maybe they have like some rich information from their ancestors, like passed down through their family members that we wouldn't learn from like a textbook. And by just sharing their perspectives, it reminds other students that they are not alone and they could relate to others. So, yeah.
I completely agree with that example about the bananas. Like I had no idea that this is where, the history of the fruit that we eat like every day is really coming from, and how dark it actually is because of where we live and the history that we're taught.
Yeah, it's really it's crazy, but I'm glad we're doing it now, and like hopefully in the future, like schools will start covering more subjects.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Alrighty, thank you for your questions. And now I am going to turn it over and I will be interviewing Dorian Franklin, and she is a senior majoring in child and adolescent studies with an emphasis in elementary education. Dorian took this class to gain a new perspective regarding ethnic studies since she has not learned much about American history from the perspective of ethnic minorities, which we just kind of discussed. Dorian will also be continuing her education as the SUF in the Combined Master's Multiple Subject Credential Program. She has found that the goals of that program, just equitable education, are closely aligned with understanding histories of oppression and the way in which we can heal and move forward through the gift of education, which is the emphasis and purpose of this course. In her personal life, she enjoys reading, hiking, and exercise, spending time with family, knitting, and listening to music. This class has taught Dorian a great deal of histories that she had no knowledge of. Since most history is taught from the perspective of the oppressors, with this interview, she hopes to explore her understanding of American history through the perspective of ethnic minorities and to learn from a nuanced explorations as well. Alrighty, and my first question is, using 3 to 5 examples from our readings, lectures, and podcasts, how do ethnic studies scholars unsettle histories of race in the hemisphere? Consider interoceanic dysphoria and Canal Zone.
So when I read this question, I really tied it back to the Entanglement podcast and how Professor Armando, as an ethnic studies scholar, kind of highlights that when we're considering the American histories, both North America and South America, we can't just consider the continental US as we know it today, because, that's obviously the importance of history and how, people migrated here and how cultures were exploited across borders since the borders were not the same back then, and how this colonialization, that's exactly the purpose, was to gain as much land, as much power as possible, and that required the exploitation of these marginalized groups. And when we're trying to unsettle it now, we need to really think about, like I said in my introduction, like the marginalized perspectives of these people and the colonial legacies of labor exploitation. So when we're looking at cultures such as in the Nuanco reading, and how the migrations and the identity of people from Panama and the Canal and the Zonians, even how when we look at their culture, we need to consider not only their culture before the colonialization, but also after as well, and how we can, kind of go back and try to work on that erasure that happened. Also, in this space podcast, when we're looking at the influences of the Jim Crow laws and how, like you said, that they were moved from the US down towards Central America, and how we kind of expanded that across cultures. And with the banana industry and the plantations that were moved there, we have to think of it globally as well. And from the Space Podcast, Professor Obando also states that when we look at race globally, we need to consider this as a white issue. And he goes back to referencing Colby and assuming that, these explanations for the colonialization were made to be biological, saying that, only Black workers can handle the conditions down there because their skin is darker, so they're the only ones that can handle that. And that's not the reality of it. So, it's a lot more complex than just kind of looking at, one side of history. We need to look at all of the sides of history. We need to listen to what they were telling people. What they're telling us, oh, you need to work down here because you have darker skin, when that's really not the case. And it's more systemic than that. It's more systemic than just, you're made to work down there kind of thing.
Yeah, great. I really like how you mentioned that we need to like also consider like not only their culture like after colonialism, but before. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really important.
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty. So for the next question, using 3 to 5 examples from our readings, lectures, and podcasts, how do we compare and contrast histories of Jim Crow in the US and Jim Crow colonialism in Central America?
Mm-hmm. Like I said in the previous question, Professor Obando kind of highlights that, Central America Jim Crow was implemented from the US Jim Crow. It was kind of moved on there as a tactic to have a successful business in the United Fruit industry and with the banana industry as a whole and plantations and things like that. But Nwanko really highlights this in that reading, talking about the segregation, like you mentioned, with, the typical way of how we interpret segregation of towns, schools, toilets, drinking fountains. And they say that even post offices were segregated as well, kind of, creating separate spaces for different races. Well, different races as in here goes white people and here goes people of color. Um, but what I found most interesting was one of the Zonians, or people born in the Panama Canal Zone, Yvette Modestin, who she talks about how it's more complex than just, separating people into different spaces. And one example that she included was that she knows various national anthems because in the US, it was more of just a Black versus white divide as compared to the Panama Canal, where it's more complex than that because we have a mix of cultures. The dark skin doesn't just mean that you are Black. It can be um, Afro-American. There's other things that these people were. And in the US, it was more just targeted towards Black people, but there was a complex mix of racial groups. And Professor Obando highlights that as well, as they needed new terminology to even discriminate these people. There wasn't names. You couldn't just call them, and the N word because it didn't have the same meaning as it did down there. And it kind of, the immigrants as well were also working in these conditions. So that was another kind of aspect of it, how we had slavery in the continental US as we know it, or in the South. And it was different down there because the enforcement wasn't done just by state laws. It wasn't done that way. Their systemic racism was from economic and political structures that influenced these people. So one example that I noticed was that in Central America, the money that they were earning from working at the United Fruit Company, they could only use at the commissaries. So that means that as much as you hate these people that you work with, and as much as you really want to fight back and resist, the pain that they're putting you through, the hard work and labor, you were also benefiting from this system because they're forcing you to work for it as well as to buy from it. So it's kind of hard to, I asked you that question about resistance and fighting back, but at the same time, like, how do you fight back if this is how you get your food? This is how you get your clothes, and this is your job, and this is how you're getting your livelihood as well. So I think it's definitely more complex in the way that the Central America Jim Crow laws were not as forward as the Southern ones. We had state laws and theirs were more economic and political displacement to put these people in a place of oppression.
Nice. I like you really went into depth with that, and it was nice to see like a different perspective. I feel like you went about it like a different way. All right. So, three, using 3 to 5 examples from readings, lectures, and podcasts. What is it urgent? Why is it urgent to read about Japanese American internment alongside American Indigenous relocation?
Mhm. I think we kind of touched on this previously as well, but colonial histories are interconnected. People that are oppressed are interconnected because of that. We need to have that collective unification to ensure that voices are heard. What is so painful about these histories of these people, and this is an example I'm going to touch on further later, but even with Minor Keith, how he recruited 700 people and only 22 of them lived. We have to kind of consider how much history was erased there, how much culture, how many stories, how many family lines were completely wiped out because, their patriarch or even their matriarch, when we're looking at the other podcast about how women of color are impacted by this as well, kind of seeing how we need to, you know, encourage each other's voices by looking at these histories side by side. So when we're looking at the Japanese American internment alongside the American Indigenous relocation, I kind of looked at the Burt reading and the examples of how the feelings of loss during a relocation and how the I'm not sure how to say his name, Anand, I'm not sure, you know what I'm talking about,
Yes,
right?
yes, I
Okay,
got it. Yes.
that the poetry, talking about the fragility of that loss through the perspective of children and how when people are being oppressed, it's not just physical, it's not just putting them through the hard work, it's also a loss of culture, a loss of identity, a loss of property. And that is seen in both the Japanese American internment, bringing them to America and relocating them as if, dehumanizing them as if they're property and moving them around, as well as the American Indigenous relocation. And Professor Obando highlights this as well when he's talking about the Trail of Tears and bringing history together through art and how, you know, obviously both examples are very different with different struggles. And at the same time, we can kind of bring each other together um, to lift each other up and kind of look back at these histories with a contemporary perspective as well. Because here we are today where we're all together in the same classroom and there's a lot of different voices, a lot of different histories. So it's important that we highlight, each one of those. And lastly, resilience and talking about survival strategies. And I like that Professor Abando in one of the podcasts, he talks about how preservation is, quote, survival as Indigenous concept, or looking at survival as an Indigenous concept, and how this is important for preservation of these cultures and preservation of these people. And I think this is also shown when we're looking at resilience, survival, displacement. It's kind of all encompassed by the fact that in that poem that we were reading in the Burt reading, the position of the speaker is no longer clear. So we're kind of being able to see ourselves in the speaker, being able to see our friends, our family, our peers that we have in these classes that are from other cultures that we're not so sure about because, we're not taught these cultures the same way that we're taught about, European history and how we can all tell you the story of Christopher Columbus, but what about, these other stories that we have going on here? And, to broaden the view, this extends across all oppressed cultures, not just in the Americas, but, in Europe and Africa, in wherever these other, in Australia, especially too, with those indigenous cultures as well. I feel like I couldn't tell you a single thing about those cultures because we're not learning them. And although we don't live there and it's not going to impact us the same way, that it's still important to kind of look at different groups side by side to really see, the similarities and to see how we can collectively memorialize these people and their cultures.
Yes, I agree. And very well said. And like I especially liked when you mentioned like encouraging each other's voices. I thought that
Mhm,
was an excellent point.
mhm.
Alrighty, next question. Using our sources, what are the similarities between working conditions for the Panama Canal and the United Fruit Workers?
So the United Fruit Workers in the Panama Canal, obviously they're interconnected based on their location, obviously in Central America. But I really enjoyed how the Colby reading highlights that throughout all of these experiences and during these times in history, that the US's goal is to gain control in
Mhm.
any way possible. And they're going to hold these territories for direct foreign control. And that means that we're going to be using those same tactics, kind of how we were talking about using those same Jim Crow laws, seeing how people are going to be suffering the same thing. So now going into the Panama Canal and United Fruit, obviously these people are suffering incredibly hard labor. The physical environment is hot, it's humid, there's mosquitoes everywhere that are spreading disease. So in both, Panama has the yellow fever and malaria and other diseases. And with United Fruit, the difficulties were the labor and how getting one cut from, cutting down a tree could be lethal as a mosquito bites you and now you have a disease. And now, people in both kind of areas are suffering in that way physically. Um, Further, there's also the low wages and like how I kind of said previously, people were getting paid money, but you can only spend the money in the commissary. So how far are you really going to get in your life? You're really not going to get out of that place in the Panama Canal or with the United Fruit Company. With the United Fruit, speaking of low wages, Indigenous and Afro descendant workers were obviously paid the lowest paying jobs. You kind of brought that up as well, how the clerical positions go to Europeans and white people and white immigrants, while, these Indigenous people are getting the low paying jobs, which are also the most physically demanding. And there's no opportunities for advancement. They're not going to, if you work hard, you're going to be able to get that white collar job. That's not how this works here. You're going to keep working that job probably until you die because it's a dangerous place to work. And the possibility of that, they're not thinking about those numbers as well. They're just thinking of how they can get more people to work for them. I also liked how the Colby reading highlights that they were maintaining strict labor segmentation across racial lines, trying to pit these people against each other as well. And that Black laborers were used for difficult work, but they were paid by task. So they're kind of in competition with one another, when in reality, if we kind of look at it from that outside perspective, we want to just say, just work together and you can try to fight back that business. But that's not how easy it was. They're paid by task. They need to get their work done. They don't have time to be, creating a union, and they don't have the power to be creating a union. They don't have the voice to be doing that as well. And with the Panama Canal, same thing. The Black workers were facing the most challenging and dangerous tasks, and they were at risk for diseases and for injuries, and for the most injuries.
Great. And my last question is to explain minorities' exploitation of ethnic groups at the start of the railway construction, just kind of explain that timeline.
So, sorry, I'm looking at my notes right here.
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay. So when I was looking at this, talking about Minor Keith, and it's so unfortunate that we have to only remember his name when we're talking about these incidences, but there's so many people that he affected and basically murdered with his expansion projects and plans. So it started with Minor Keith saying that we're going to build this railway to San Jose. So at first he starts recruiting these Costa Rican people to work at this railway. And very quickly they realize that this is a dangerous job that they do not want. Like I said, there's yellow fever, there's dysentery, everything that you could think you will die of, you would. And at that point, if you're not going to die of that, you're going to die of wounds that will at some point be affected by yellow fever, malaria, dysentery because of the mosquitoes and just because of the poor working conditions. And, we're not sanitizing things at the same time. So it's just an incredibly dangerous place to work, and incredibly dangerous to work here and then bring that back to your family, to bring that back to the people that you live with as well. So the people in Costa Rica said, no, thank you. We are not doing this anymore. So they kind of back out. So Minor Keith continues to work, and he recruits hundreds of thousands of people, and hundreds of thousands of people die. And I think what was jarring to read from this as well was that his brothers were in there. His two brothers died as well. And it's kind of like, how far are you going to go to, have this power, to have this money, to have this control over people for this railway? So after that, then they kind of move on to recruiting Italian immigrants from Northern America, Chinese immigrants as well. This is from the NPR podcast. I don't know if I said that, but from the There Will Be Bananas podcast, recruiting these Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and European immigrants as well, to kind of work on those last parts of the railway that were not constructed yet. And like I said, a tree falls down, you get cut, and you're getting bit by a mosquito, and now you're infected, and people were continuing to die. So that's how the hundreds of thousands of those people died. So he kind of goes to his last resort of going to these hopeless prisoners in NOLA or New Orleans, and they were in these jails, and he offered pardons to them. And I think this was the most difficult part for me to read, was that there were 700 prisoners that he recruited, and out of those 700 were the 25 survivors. And like I mentioned earlier, we can only just imagine how many family lines, how much history and how much culture was just wiped out purely because Minor Keith wanted to, exploit these people just for his own gain. And this broadening this concept kind of highlights how racism is systemic, and it's not as simple as, people saying that, oh, they just need to get a job so that they can, get out of there. Minor Keith is a great example of how you are putting people in these conditions and they're not going to get out. They're going to get sick. They're not going to be able to advance. And it's not for the benefit of them because all of these people died. The 25 people that continue to live, I'm sure they did not. It doesn't say it specifically in the reading, but when you kind of think of how hard labor works, people are losing fingers and it's just a thing because they don't have the same medical advances that we have now. So it kind of all ties back to that. The conditions that were provided were horrific, and that's what caused these people to suffer this racism, and that continues to go, and that continues to go generationally, and we still see it today. We still see it in the people that are living in densely populated areas. In California, we see it all the time. People are in other states are told, move to California, it's easier to be homeless there because of the weather, and they move here and they're still homeless. They're moving to Skid Row where there is drugs, there is difficult places to work. We're seeing it in fast fashion in other countries where there's children being recruited to work, told that they're going to live, and they're being paid 10 cents an hour to make 50, $5 shirts that we're going to wear out to dinner. And at the same time, we're contributing to that. And it's kind of difficult because how do we get out of that when we're not the people in power? That was kind of long-winded, but I just wanted to make sure that we talked about all of those things at the same time.
No, no, that was great. And I really appreciate you I really appreciate seeing your perspective. It's so different on how we focused on different resources and how I really appreciated what you did is that you went beyond the reading and beyond the podcast and you really thought about how it affects that person. I feel like you put yourself in the shoes of those labor workers, how you mentioned that how they were put, between a rock and a hard place, the working conditions are difficult, but what else am I supposed to be doing? I can't really go back home and I have to work
Right.
and get this money, but then give the money back to them. And it's just this vicious cycle. And
Mhm.
I like that you also thought about their families, they're over here getting sick and they wouldn't want to bring that back over to them. And
Exactly.
what I really appreciate that you did is that you connected it to what the issues that we're seeing today, like how you just mentioned fast fashion and homelessness. So it's just really cool seeing that different perspective and seeing how we both interpreted the questions in a different way, but
Right.
also,
I
connected.
think you also did a great job of that too. And I kind of talked between your questions, but one thing that really stuck with me from your questions was your first answer and talking about how racism doesn't always involve troops and it doesn't always involve, seeing people get murdered right in front of you.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we even see that now with ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and we're able to see it with our phones and seeing people and families being murdered and used and killed, and it's horrific, but that is how systemic racism works. That is how these people are still being oppressed. And as much as we can encourage diversity and inclusion in school, and like how I mentioned, even for your program as well, for multiple subject, that just equitable education, we're learning it and we have the power to learn education. And what we do past this class is take it one step further, and you teach others, and you teach others how we can grow from that. And I've also one more thing. I've also seen kind of the argument about how are we moving forward if we just keep reliving these stories,
Mhm.
kind of just instead of moving forward to keep talking about these stories, people want us to just forget these histories. And I think the important part is that we learn from these histories. History repeats itself. So let's, talk about it here. Let's have these discussions. Let's talk about these discussions where, all these people are dying and it's hard for us to talk about, but that was their reality. That person that died from Minor Keith was someone's dad, someone's uncle,
Mhm.
someone's brother, things like that. So I think the importance of us talking about it and that collective memory that you were talking about, that collective unification of cultures and working alongside other people to raise each other up, lift these voices up, and have these discussions is how we combat systemic racism, especially in education as future educators. Even though we're working with, kinder through third, that lower elementary range, but that's really where it starts.
So.
And I think that we could definitely grow from that and continue to, teach that younger generation how we can move on.
Yes, I completely agree. And that was beautifully said. And yeah, just giving a voice to the voiceless and just bringing each other up. And how our professor has told us time and time again is we're not alone in this. And I feel like the first step is to make those connections and build those relationships, to build each other up and to move past from this. Not to forget it because it's
Mhm.
important, but
Yeah,
to grow from it.
to grow from it and to learn from it and
Yeah.
have these discussions. Oh, I'm so happy we did this project together. That was awesome.
I know.
One more time, our title was Unsettling Histories, Exploring Colonial Narratives in the Americas. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.